In medieval Europe, forests sometimes offered food without cultivation. After rain, mushrooms could appear quickly near villages and paths. People understood that some mushrooms caused illness. Yet gathering continued during difficult periods. This was not ignorance, but adaptation. When harvests were unreliable and options limited, visible and accessible foods became part of survival. Risk was weighed against hunger, not against modern standards of safety. In medieval Europe, large areas of land were covered by forests, especially outside major agricultural centres. These woodlands were not empty wildernesses, but working landscapes used for grazing animals, collecting firewood, and gathering seasonal foods. Within this environment, mushrooms occupied a particular position. They required no sowing, no tools, and no long-term investment of labour. When conditions were right, they appeared on their own. This mattered in societies where agricultural production was slow, labour-intensive, and vulnerable to disruption. Fields demanded planning months in advance, while forests offered foods that could be gathered with little preparation. Mushrooms did not replace cultivated crops, but they reduced complete dependence on them. Their presence softened moments of strain, especially when households faced delayed harvests or temporary shortages. It is important to note that medieval people did not view forests as unlimited food sources. Woodland resources were finite, seasonal, and often regulated by custom or authority. Mushroom gathering existed within these limits. It was not a strategy of abundance, but one of responsiveness. The forest did not guarantee nourishment, but it sometimes offered opportunity. That distinction helps explain why mushrooms remained part of the food landscape despite their uncertainties. Medieval food supply was shaped by instability rather than consistency. Grain harvest depended heavily on weather patterns that could not be controlled or predicted with accuracy. Excessive rain, early frost or drought, could reduce yields enough to affect entire regions. Even when crops were not destroyed outright, small losses accumulated quickly across seasons. Animal-based foods were also unreliable. Livestock required fodder, shelter and health, all of which fluctuated with climate and disease. Meat consumption followed irregular rhythms tied to slaughter cycles, preservation capacity, and religious calendars. For many households, daily diets relied on careful balancing rather than steady access. In this context, foraging functioned as a form of adjustment rather than substitution. Mushrooms were not gathered because they solved hunger permanently, but because they filled narrow gaps. They appeared during periods when stored foods were thinning and new harvests were not yet ready. Their timing mattered more than their nutritional completeness. Surviving sources rarely describe these moments in detail, but patterns emerge across regions. When systems were strained, people widened their definition of food. Mushroom gathering reflected this flexibility. It was a response to uncertainty, shaped by the necessity rather than culinary preference. Medieval mushroom gathering was shaped by experience rather than written instruction. There is no evidence that people approached forests without caution. Instead, knowledge circulated locally, built through repetition and observation. Families learned which mushrooms appeared in familiar places at certain times of year and alongside recognizable plants or trees. This knowledge was practical, not systematic, and it varied by region. Such understanding did not eliminate danger. Sources occasionally mention illness linked to wild foods, suggesting that mistakes did occur. However, the continued presence of mushroom gathering across generations implies that people identified patterns they trusted. They focused on a limited number of familiar types rather than experimenting widely. In many areas, avoidance of unfamiliar mushrooms was itself a safety practice. It is important not to overstate the precision of this knowledge. Medieval people lacked modern classification systems and chemical understanding. Their judgments relied on memory, resemblance, and social reinforcement. Yet within constrained environments, this approach reduced uncertainty enough to be usable. What survives in the historical record is fragmentary, but the logic is consistent. Risk was managed through narrowing choices, not expanding them. Mushroom gathering persisted not because it was foolproof, but because accumulated experience made it less unpredictable than doing nothing. One reason mushrooms remained part of medieval diets lies in timing. Unlike crops, which required months of growth and planning, mushrooms emerged quickly after rainfall. This sudden appearance mattered most during transitional periods, particularly late summer and early autumn, when stored foods were declining but new harvests were not yet secure. During these intervals, households faced practical constraints. Grain reserves were rationed carefully, and fresh foods were limited. Mushrooms did not provide complete nourishment, but they offered immediacy. Their presence required no waiting, no processing beyond basic preparation, and no advance investment. In moments of uncertainty, speed itself had value. This does not suggest that people preferred mushrooms or trusted them completely. Rather, availability altered decision-making. When alternatives were distant or delayed, foods that appeared spontaneously gained importance. The choice was shaped by circumstance, not by confidence. Historical sources rarely describe these short gaps directly, but agricultural rhythms make them likely. Mushroom gathering fits within that rhythm. It responded to delays rather than replacing structured food systems. In this sense, mushrooms mattered less for what they were than for when they appeared. Medieval communities did not approach food choices with the expectation of safety as it is understood today. Risk was an accepted condition of daily life, shaped by limits in storage, transport, and medical knowledge. This does not mean danger was ignored. Rather, it was evaluated within narrow margins. Mushroom gathering reflects this mindset. People recognized that harm was possible, yet avoidance was not always practical. In constrained environments, decisions were made comparatively. The risk of eating unfamiliar foods was weighed against the certainty of hunger. Complete refusal to gather from forests could increase vulnerability rather than reduce it. From this perspective, mushroom gathering appears less reckless and more calculated. It represented exposure to manageable uncertainty rather than blind chance. It is also important to acknowledge that medieval people did not share a uniform understanding of danger. Experiences differed by region, class, and access to alternatives. What appeared risky in one context might have seemed unavoidable in another. This variation complicates any simple judgment. What remains consistent is the logic of constraint. Risk was not eliminated but distributed across daily practices. Mushroom gathering was one such practice. It functioned within a broader system where survival depended on managing hazards, not escaping them. Mushroom gathering was not universal across medieval Europe. Evidence suggests significant regional variation in how communities viewed and used wild fungi. In some areas, mushrooms appear rarely in records, implying avoidance or limited reliance. In others, a small number of species were gathered consistently and cautiously. This uneven pattern suggests choice rather than ignorance. Environmental conditions played a role. Forest composition, climate and soil affected which mushrooms appeared, and how frequently. Cultural attitudes also mattered. Some communities developed strong traditions of selective foraging, while others treated mushrooms with suspicion. These differences reflect local adaptation rather than a single European practice. It is important not to project modern mushroom cultures backward. Medieval use was narrower and more restrained. People tended to focus on familiar varieties and avoided expanding their range. Where mushrooms were used, they occupied defined roles rather than serving as staples. This diversity challenges the idea of a shared medieval approach to risk. Instead, it points to multiple strategies shaped by environment and custom. Mushroom gathering occurred where it made sense within local limits. Where it did not, it faded from practice. That flexibility underscores how survival strategies were shaped by context rather than habit alone. Mushrooms did not function as staple foods in medieval Europe. They rarely replaced bread, grain, or porridge, which formed the caloric foundation of most diets. Instead, mushrooms played a limited and supplementary role. They added variety, moisture, and some nutrients, but they were not relied upon for long-term sustenance. Their seasonal and unpredictable nature prevented them from becoming central. Most mushrooms were consumed shortly after gathering. Preservation methods were limited, and drying or storing fungi was uncommon compared to grains or legumes. This reinforced their temporary role. Mushrooms filled moments rather than seasons. They appeared, were used, and disappeared again without reshaping food systems. This marginal position helps explain why mushroom gathering persisted despite risk. The stakes were lower than if mushrooms had been relied upon as core nourishment. Small quantities reduced exposure, and consumption remained situational. People did not build survival strategies around mushrooms alone. They integrated them cautiously into existing meals. Historical silence around mushrooms also reflects this status. Foods that were supplemental and short-lived left fewer traces in records. Their absence from many sources does not imply insignificance but limitation. Mushrooms mattered because they fit into meals without demanding trust beyond what their role required. Mushroom gathering was often embedded within existing patterns of work rather than treated as a separate activity. People who moved regularly through forests, such as woodcutters, herders, charcoal burners and foragers, encountered mushrooms as part of their routines. Access depended less on intention and more on presence. This mattered because labour shaped food availability. Time and energy were limited, and tasks overlapped. Gathering mushrooms while tending animals or collecting firewood required little additional effort. In this sense, food followed movement rather than planning. What was seen could be gathered, what was distant could not. Such integration reduced the perceived risk of gathering. Familiar paths and repeated environments made recognition easier, even without formal classification. Mushrooms appeared in known places alongside other signs of seasonal change. This familiarity likely increased confidence, though not certainty. The relationship between work and food also explains regional variation. Communities with less forest-based labour encountered fewer opportunities to gather mushrooms. Where daily life remained closer to fields or settlements, mushrooms played a smaller role. Their use reflected rhythms of movement and labour rather than dietary preference alone. Choosing not to gather mushrooms did not automatically create better alternatives. For many medieval households, food options were already narrow. Cultivated crops required land, labour and time. Animal products depended on herd size, fodder availability and health. Preserved foods relied on prior surplus, fuel and storage conditions. When these elements were strained, avoidance alone solved little. In this context, refusing mushrooms did not eliminate risk. It shifted it elsewhere. Hunger carried its own dangers, especially for the children, the elderly, and those performing physical labour. Households had to navigate between imperfect choices rather than choose between safety and danger. Mushroom gathering represented one option among many constrained responses. This perspective helps explain why gathering persisted even where awareness of danger existed. The decision was rarely about preference. It was about managing scarcity within limits. When other foods demanded resources that were unavailable, visible forest foods became part of the calculation. Historical records often emphasize rules, prohibitions, or ideals. Everyday decisions made under pressure are harder to trace, yet the logic remains consistent across contexts of scarcity. Mushroom gathering reflected constrained agency. People acted within what was possible, not what was optimal. Understanding this helps avoid projecting modern expectations onto medieval choices. Mushrooms were gathered in medieval Europe not because they were considered safe, but because they were sometimes available when other foods were not. Their use reveals a food system shaped by adaptation rather than control. Survival did not remove risk from daily life. It required managing it within narrow margins. Mushroom gathering fits this pattern. It was cautious, limited, and situational. What stands out is how clearly medieval food decisions were shaped by constraint. People worked with what appeared in front of them, guided by experience and necessity rather than ideals of safety or abundance. This does not mean danger was ignored. It means danger was lived with. Risk was part of the environment, not an exception to it. There are limits to what we can know. Sources are uneven, regional practices varied, and everyday meals were rarely documented in detail. What can be traced is a consistent logic across marginal conditions. When systems were strained, people adjusted definitions of food rather than waiting for stability. This history encourages restraint in judgment. Medieval mushroom gathering was neither reckless nor naive. It was a response to constrained systems. The lesson is not about mushrooms themselves, but about how survival choices emerge when options are limited.